Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this second seminar of the Axon Johnson Centre for the Study of Classical Architecture here at Downing College in Cambridge. Welcome to everybody in the room. Thank you for coming, and welcome to everybody who I know is joining us online. I think we have a sizable audience online today as well, so you're very welcome. And if people online would like to type questions into chat at the end of today's seminar, then we will do our best to answer those questions. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Frank Salmon. I'm the director of the centre. And for those of you who have been my undergraduates, you will know that I tend to wear themed ties for lectures and occasions like this. So I'm honouring our speaker today by wearing my Greek Revival Athenian tie, though whoever made the tie didn't know which way up Athenians went. Fortunately, our speaker today knows exactly how elements of Greek architecture should be placed. We could have nobody better to talk to us about this subject than Lena Lambrinou. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Elizabeth Deans, Assistant Director, to introduce Lena. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. We are a Vane Center. I'm wearing terracotta color today and to reflect our Greek subject. I'm so happy personally and professionally to welcome Lena today to speak. Lena is both architect and archaeologist. I want to make sure I get this correct, of the monuments restoration for the Acropolis, is that right? For the Hellenic Ministry of Culture and Sports, but this is part of the larger ministry for Greek culture, which you've been a part of now for 23 years. And what I find so outstanding about Lena's career, I think we have several people in the audience from history of art, architectural history, classics, archaeology, possibly conservation, but Lena has done that all. Lena has degrees in all of those subjects. So she's done an extraordinary amount of thinking also not only about the Parthenon, which we look at today, but Lena has, I think you've thought about the whole site of the Acropolis from Roman antiquity as well, through the Middle Ages, through its time as a mosque, to the modern era as well. So you've gone through the whole chronology of the site, the building, its use and its materials, from everything from its iron to steel staples, to thinking about graffiti on the Parthenon. Her office sits right beside the Parthenon. So we're really thrilled to welcome you. Thank you for coming to us from Athens today. And we're thrilled to hear your talk today, Conquering Forgetfulness in the Parthenon, the preservation of ruins and cultural memory of the Athenian Acropolis. And I should also just mention that you have been elected also as Associate Professor of the National Technical Museum at the University of Athens. So we're thrilled. So please, everyone, welcome Lena. And we anticipate learning a great deal from you today. So thank you, Lena.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm very excited to be in Cambridge, of course. I'm very glad to give you this talk today. I hope you will enjoy it too. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by pointing out that monuments erected to prolong and ensure the survival of an historical communal memory can be identified in every society that possesses an evolved self-consciousness and sensitivity to the distinction of its own culture. Inherent within such public displays is a universal need to connect the living with the familiar, still somehow inspirational past, a past of such importance exactly because of this remembered intimacy and meaning. A past whose memory or material traces, therefore, are considered worthy of recognition, preservation, and perpetuation for the future. In today's preservation of cultural artifacts or monumental structures as historical relics, exemplified by the ongoing efforts to preserve the Acropolis monuments at Athens, questions of communal memory and how it should be manifested materially remain fundamental. Today, we will talk about the restoration of ancient monuments and the dilemmas that arise for experts and non-experts concerning the ideology of preserving these structures. We will also look at some aspects of the practical application of restorations. Let's begin with the story of Theseus, the great hero of Athens, the mythical founder of the city. We probably all know the legend about the ship that brought Theseus and his companions to Athens from Crete, where Theseus had killed the Minotaur and liberated Athens from the Minoans. Plutarch informs us in the 1st century AD that the Athenians had continued to preserve and maintain his ship until the time of Demetrius of Phaleron, the governor of Athens appointed by Cassander in the late 4th century BC, when Athens was under the occupation of the Macedonians. Plutarch mentions this story to address the theoretical paradox that this story of preservation had created in the philosophical circles of Athens. That is the question of the material authenticity of a historical document, the preservation of its being in time, or as we would put it today, the question of identity in space and time. The existence of the ship of Theseus allowed the Athenians to presume the existence of the hero himself and the veracity of his story. Its preservation was thus an attempt to preserve his memory through a tangible object. Although preserving a wooden ship involved the occasional replacement of its perishable material, ancient Athenian society nevertheless perceived this object as an actual historical relic, one which had once truly belonged to their hero, an authentic cultural heirloom, and a vehicle for collective civic memory. Of course, the philosophical paradox here involves two distinct but interrelated questions. First is the question of the authenticity of the object itself. Is this the real ship of Theseus? While the second question is, did Theseus actually exist? The existence of his ship ostensibly proved the existence of the hero, while the preservation of its material being reinforced the idea of its identification as the hero's actual ship. In other words, the existence of a real ship supposedly confirmed the existence of the hero. But the decay or destruction of the wooden ship's material could, although not necessarily, call into question the very historical status of its owner. Also, if this particular vessel is not the real ship of Theseus, then did such a real ship ever exist? Or if not, did the hero ever really exist? The questions continue. The paradox of the ship faced by the Athenians, therefore, lies in the following: if we gradually replace the perishable material or a revered culturally important object, does it remain the same object? Is it still the historic ship of Theseus? Some Athenian thinkers said yes, while others said no, admits Plutarch. Those on the yes side believed in the authenticity of the idea of the hero's existence, which remained unchanged. Those on the no side believed in the value of the ship's material authenticity. If that was lost, then the proof of its historical existence was also lost. It is important to note that this Thesean's story from Plutarch, apparently a retelling from an earlier author, takes place in Athens during the city's 4th century BC occupation by the Macedonians, as I said before. That is, in a city that has turned to its mythical past to demonstrate and ensure with proof a heroic national identity in order to counteract the barbarous suppression of Athens by the Macedonian invaders. In this light, the emotional significance of such a relic for the Athenians is understandable. They took enormous pride in having the hero's ship in their city, in displaying tangible evidence of a connection with their heroic mythical king. Through its identification, the Athenians defined themselves as Theseus's descendants, a great people, while also asserting their historical identity and demonstrating their deep indigenous traditions. The above story brings together all the contradictions that concern us still today, when preserving and especially when restoring every relic of artifact of the past, large or small. Thus, the choice or decision to preserve important objects or monuments of the past is interpreted as one, a collective need to connect with the historical roots of our culture, while at the same time to an appropriation as proof of our relevance to an extraordinary past of which we are descendants. The psychological need behind such a decision is universal and significant. The establishment of a connection with the glorious past is nourished by a hope of its revival. Conversely, the preservation of authentic objects from the past allows the confirmation of the existence of this extraordinary past through that tangible evidence. In the case of the Athenian Acropolis, for example, we know that Pericles and the temple he built for Athens actually existed. Why? Because we do have the Parthenon. Clearly, we can understand then how much a fascination an authentic object from the distant past exerts on a society's collective consciousness, even more so when it comes to a large monumental work of architecture. Consequently, we come to our question of the day. Is the Parthenon a modern day ship of Theseus? Let us imagine for a moment what it is like to have in front of us a ruin for which we are responsible for its future fate. In this case, we are faced with two basic questions. Shall we repair it and restore it with great care as if it were our now departed grandmother's beloved house that we want to return to use? Or is the building so charming, a ruin, that we should decide to leave it just as we have found it, only partly preserved, cloaked in moss, lichen, mineral accretions, the ancient patina left through the passage of time? These two questions highlight the restorers' two diametrically opposed approaches to the treatment of an historic building: the utilitarian, invasive approach and the antiquarian, romantic approach. Historically, these are the two approaches of the French and British schools of restoration during the 19th century. The French school, with its main proponent, Jean-Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, was responsible for a trend of over-restoration in the middle of 19th century, intended to achieve a so-called purism, the approach of the French called for drastic interventions, aiming to return historic buildings to a complete, stylistically correct form, which quite often, however, had never existed. It was the architect restorer himself who chose the appropriate section to successfully realize what he deemed to be the right restorational result, accomplished by making corrections, that is, through the removal of all later additions to the building and even the correction of the original design. This purist approach from the self-taught Viollet-le-Duc greatly influenced in all of Europe in the 19th century, including, of course, Greece, and represented the mainstream ideology in restorations of the time. Nevertheless, alternative viewpoints also gained ground. In Britain, the perceived profligacy of arbitrary reconstructions led to the extreme anti-restoration, anti-invasiveness movement of William Morris. A particular influence within this approach was the Victorian art theorist John Ruskin, who, through a sense of romantic conservatism, recognized the rights of historical buildings, that is, the need not to disturb them with any kind of barbaric reconstruction. Ruskin advocated allowing these buildings a dignified death. Furthermore, at a time when the substance of history versus the nature of art became a major subject of debate, Alois Riegel, that's a little bit before. And then the next, William Morris. I'm sorry. And Ruskin. And Alois Riegel, the Austrian theorist and philosopher, developed the idea of the absolute value of human objects as evidence of an unrepeatable stage in their evolution of history. Ancient buildings, according to Riegel, should be considered works of art, with every flaw or distortion in their form being accepted and preserved as a defining stage in the historical course or development of the building itself. Here, for the first time, the quality of being ancient is introduced as a supreme value. The primary concern of Riegel was the historical dimension of monuments, while all other values were subordinate. Thus, the concept of the monument was liberated and expanded to include the artistic creations of all periods of history. Now, in Italy, such perspectives influence the scientific, also known as the historical or archaeological approach to the restoration of monuments, a movement led by Camillo Boito and Gustavo Giovannoni. The important notion here was the preservation of the historical environment through the qualities of authenticity and historicity. The clear distinction in this approach between the new additions made to a building and the ancient parts echoes the ideas of Giuseppe Valadier and Raphael Stern of the early 19th century. For Boito and later Giovannoni, intervention, when necessary, is important, and cleaning or conservation should be done before one goes on to restoration. Boito felt, opposite to what Ruskin had argued, that under no circumstances should a monument be allowed to die. This approach also influenced restorers in Greece in the 19th and early 20th centuries. As we now turn here to the historical course of restorations on the Athenian Acropolis and in the Parthenon, we see elements of all these restorational approaches and their contradictions, beginning from the earliest modern interventions in the era after the founding of the modern Greek state. For many centuries, the Acropolis hill or sacred rock represented the religious center of the city of Athens. The renowned temple of the goddess Athena, the Athenians' patron deity, stood on its most prominent point from the middle of the 5th century BC. Following Athena in the 6th century AD, the Virgin Mary came to be worshipped by the city's Christians in the very same building. During the Ottoman Turkish occupation of Athens, the Parthenon was converted into a mosque and the whole hill transformed into a strong fortress for the defense of the city. This was why the Parthenon became the target of a severe bombardment at the end of the 17th century by Venetian troops who besieged the Acropolis fortress in order to take over Athens. The massive explosion that destroyed the Great Parthenon Temple in September of 1687 marked the end of the war between the Turks and Venetians, as well as the demise of this great building. The Parthenon became a convenient quarry for the inhabitants of the area, who plundered the scattered and fractured blocks of the destroyed building, while antiquarians also carted away the sculptured masterpieces that had once adorned it. The establishment of the Greek state in 1827, 1830 was marked with a great change in the general attitude toward the antiquities of Greece. Due to the Ottoman occupation, Greece had missed out on the evolution of European preservationist thinking that was directly introduced into a late stage of neoclassicism. The first king of Greece, the young Otto von Wittelsbach, son of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, and his royal court were animated with a strong Philhellenic spirit in accordance with German Hellenism or in a neo-humanistic Greco-Philhellenism. And they sought to refocus Greek national identity through a deep appreciation for classical antiquity. The architectural and artistic remains of the Greek classical period in particular were judged to be the only antiquities worthy of attention, while the ubiquitous traces of the Roman era, let alone those of still later periods, were considered of minor value. The Athenian Acropolis became a central symbol of the Greek nation's revival. The prominent hill in the midst of the new Greek capital, hosting ancient temples of the classical period, shrouded with structures of Byzantine, Ottoman, medieval date, received the primary attention of the new Philhellene king. The classical centrism favored by Otto and other authorities cultivated in the modern Greek consciousness the idea of an unbroken continuity with the golden age of classical Periclean Athens, and encouraged a selective attitude among officials regarding which antiquities to save. The main factor in the planning of interventions on ancient Greek ruins was clearly the aesthetics of purity, which encouraged stylistic restorations through the removal of most post-classical remains. Medieval and early modern structures, in particular, which were associated with historically painful or dishonorable episodes in the nation's past, such as the Frankish Tower on the Western Acropolis at the entrance. I can show. Anyway, you can see the tower besides the propylae. It's a long building. And the Ottoman mosque inside the Parthenon, the ruined Parthenon, here is the mosque, were demolished to unveil the classical monuments in response to contemporary demands for stylistic clarity. Archaeological sites were reserved only for research and restoration, with no other modern uses allowed. By the mid-1830s, the prevailing view on the preservation and elaboration of Greek antiquities had entered a practical stage. However, the term anastylosis, the putting back of fallen architectural members onto their original building, was still unknown, as it was only introduced and put into common use a century later. Instead, Greece's intensive restorational interventions were described as a new erection of the monuments, a renovation, the erection or completion of the antiquities. At the same time, opposing voices rose against all such intensive interventions in Greece, primarily from British commentators, antiquarian circles, and other intellectuals. Among the last was William Moore, who argued that extended reconstructions, even using fallen authentic, we went back. Okay, William Moore. Even using fallen authentic material would destroy the historicity of the ruins. These opposers called for a romantic approach to the monuments with minimal intervention to the historic scenery, a view that foreshadowed the anti-restoration movement. These ideas did not gain traction, however, as they were incompatible with the neoclassical spirit of the Bavarian court and its need to manage the ancient monuments for the glory of their king. For Greece, at the time, the idea of resurrecting the ancient relics was politically connected with the symbolic resurrection of the Greek nation. Prominent figures such as the neoclassical architect Leo von Klenze, a powerful counselor of King Ludwig, formalized the first scientific principles for the management of ancient relics in Greece. The most important restoration of the period of the Acropolis was the total reconstruction of the small classical temple of Athena Nike in 1835-36 by archaeologists Ludwig Ross and architects Christian Hansen and Edward Schaubert, which relied mostly on the temple's original material. The building had been dismantled by the Ottoman Turks in 1687, and its members used in strengthening the Acropolis's fortification walls. Ross reconstructed most of the temple by demolishing these early modern walls and recollecting the building's ancient material. He used porous and marble for the filling in of damaged ancient members without any carving or decorative details. Also, in accordance with then current practices, no consideration was given to resetting the ancient members in their original positions on the building. The reconstruction of Athena Nike Temple was thus the first real resurrection of a monument of the 5th century BC that gave material expression to neoclassical ideas for the restoration of ancient Greek monuments. In 1842, amateur archaeologist Kyriakos Pitakis took charge of operations on the Acropolis, while the Bavarians were pushed away following a wave of nationalism that made it hard for foreigners to work in Greece. Pitakis conducted empirical interventions on the Acropolis monuments that lacked any systematic study or documentation of the buildings. They were consequently described as unmethodical and by chance. In the Parthenon, Pitakis reset parts of the flanking walls of the cella, reinforcing the northern one with a massive brick wall. You see that here at the left, as well as parts of the flanking colonnades. In the Retheion, he reconstructed the south wall using fired bricks to fill gaps between the original marble wall stones. In both buildings, Pitakis placed architectural members randomly without regard for their original positions, but according to the state of their preservation. Missing portions of the columns were filled in with brickwork in a simple cylindrical form without following the shape of the fluting. Pitakis' use of brickwork was similar to the method then being employed in contemporary Italian interventions on ancient Roman buildings in Rome, but especially on ancient Greek temples in Campania and Sicily, where machine-made bricks were chosen due to economic limitations. Subsequently, the negative assessment of this first anastylosis on the Acropolis, in particular of Pitakis' amateurism, led to a significant change in the choice of restorers for the next phase of interventions. A new era on the Acropolis preservation works began in the late 19th century with the interventions of Nikolaos Balanos, a Greek civil engineer trained in Paris. Balanos originally came to the Acropolis after the earthquake of 1894 to repair the Parthenon's west side and the west porch of its opisthodomos. He stayed on to restore other Acropolis monuments and gained enough influence to become the sole authority on the Acropolis restoration works for almost 40 years. His involvement on the Acropolis between 1898 and 1938 was distinguished by an invasive methodology and the use of innovative but untested materials. With his arrival, archaeologists had now given way to engineers who were trained in construction but lacked any archaeological background. Nevertheless, this employment of Greek engineers and technicians established a new scientific standard for the structural and static strength of ensuing 20th century restorations. Balanos's approach was greatly influenced by his French training, as well as by echoes of neoclassical ideals for monumental interventions that continued to resound in Greece. He also incorporated ideas from the Italians' archaeological methods and their acceptance of reconstructions using an ancient structure's original material. He was aware, moreover, of the British anti-restoration movement, which promoted new techniques and consolidation of materials in order to safeguard the authenticity of a building's historic fabric. Characteristic of Balanos's Acropolis interventions was his use of methods derived from contemporary construction techniques, which unfortunately had never been used previously on ancient monuments. Balanos attempted to resolve the Acropolis monuments' static and aesthetic problems resulting from their initial restorational treatment by conducting extensive reconstructions and completing parts of the Acropolis buildings using their own scattered material. He would even solve the ends of two different ancient blocks and join them together in order to produce a composite, supposedly authentic ancient member. Following the then current French constructional technique of hiding reinforcements within the material of a structure, Balanos embedded strong metal beams inside the original marble of the Acropolis's ancient buildings, a technique he first attempted when reinforcing the marble beams of the Erechtheions caryatid porch in 1909. Balanos also chose iron reinforced concrete, an innovative and extremely durable material, to fill in the missing parts of marble architectural members of the Acropolis's ancient monuments. In doing this, he introduced new problems as he had overestimated the resistance of concrete to moisture and weathering. Over time, cracks or open joints of the ancient material, especially in the case of the Parthenon, combined with a lack of any sealant, allowed the penetration of atmospheric moisture and provoked the corrosion of the internal iron reinforcements. The resulting expansion of the corroded iron elements then caused cracking within the temple's marble fabric. Its restored blocks thus failed and began to fall apart. You see here two of the clamps he used to connect parts of a member, architectural member, and they are very corroded. And this is the sign here of the corroded clamp when we took it away from the member. Another of Balanos's controversial aims for his intervention, which was announced theoretically but not accomplished practically, was his intention to precisely identify the original positions of the monument's scattered members. In fact, Balanos's misplacement of column, drums, and entablature members proved to be another notable misstep. The general principle of restoring ancient architectural members to their original positions on a building had long been a goal of archaeologically minded architects. As a technique of restoration, it had previously been applied by Italian restorers, as mentioned before, and was first promoted in Greece by the French archaeologist Théophile Homo in 1905. Oh, I don't know why does that, it goes back. It's his attempts here, and following his successful anastylosis of the treasury of the Athenians at Delphi. Other pro-restoration French specialists, including the architect Lucien Magne, called for extensive restorations to be implemented in accordance with ancient building methods. For example, in the joining of dry stone masonry with metal clamps, as we saw before, a principle that Balanos did try to apply on the Acropolis monuments. Although attendees of the 1931 International Congress of Archaeology in Athens and the ensuing Athens' Charter of 1931 on the restoration of ancient monuments sang Balanos' praises, a backlash very soon arose against his interventions, with particularly acute criticism for his choice of materials. 35 years later, the increasingly damaging effects of Balanos' corroding iron reinforcements and clamps on the Acropolis monuments, original architectural members, became a matter of the greatest urgency. Consequently, Greek cultural authorities decided to commence new anastylosis on the Acropolis after 1975. The severe widespread impact of Balanos' harmful restorations required a comprehensive new approach to be planned and executed by multidisciplinary scientific teams with a high level of technical competency. With the renewed establishment of the Republic in Greece in 1974, the great architectural symbol of the Republic, democracy, the Parthenon, once again entered the center of interest. Greece's leaders felt it too should be reborn from its ashes. The Ministry of Culture thus decided to start new restorations of the Acropolis, which eventually began in 1977. The modern basis for restoration in Greece in the post-war era, post-war II era, is provided by the nationally adopted charters, including the 1964 Venice Charter on Historic Structures and other more recent agreements. Restorational interventions promoting only the aesthetic values of a monument are condemned, while honesty with regard to materials and methods is advocated, both for the internal and external fabric of a historic structure. This present-day respect for the original structural system and authentic material of a building, even in unseen areas, which surpasses neoclassical aesthetic ideals, has evolved through the modernist architectural movement and its emphasis on honesty and material justice. Relevant reversibility of interventions is also of high priority, while new materials should accompany the ancient and not the opposite. However, since the common current impulse is to intervene, not simply to preserve historic structures as they are, the extent of proposed interventions continues to be debated. The latest international conventions, exemplified by that of Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe, in 2003, have advocated a less rigid approach, even in questions of reversibility, now viewed simply as repeated repairability and international interventional extent, while also promoting the preservation of the natural or cultural sentiment, the authentic spirit, and the feeling of an historic setting. In accordance with such current ideas for cultural interventions, Greece's contemporary restorers on the Acropolis have had to reconsider a number of now familiar questions. These include: which phase do we restore? What is the preferred static strength that we want to give the Acropolis remains? For whom are we restoring? What method do we use? To what extent do we proceed? And how reversible is our intervention? Balanos' intensive, invasive, and irreversible restorations had a tremendous detrimental impact on subsequent interventions, and still today mark the unfortunate starting point for our modern attempts at preservation and restoration. Some of the above questions, however, come too late for the Acropolis, with the appropriation of the sacred rock as an archaeological preserve and the consequent enforced cessation of its practical history. The Acropolis ruins now exist only in a static, de facto, post-historical situation. And yet, as human pressures persist on the Acropolis, the Parthenon and surrounding monuments continue to have their own historical course. Balanos established a tradition of international techniques, both positive and negative, which as an irreversible part of the building's histories have proven impossible to ignore. The renewed restoration on the Acropolis has provided an opportunity to examine more closely some of the issues surrounding modern constructions. The fundamental aims and methods of the present interventions on the Acropolis as sixfold as follows. First, the partial reconstruction of the original forms of the Acropolis buildings with acceptance of their current character as ruins. Second, the use of modern state-of-the-art technology, just as Balanos similarly drew on the technology of his time. However, the focus is now on the detailed documentation and interpretation of the ancient structure in accordance with archaeological methodology and the determination of the static performance of the buildings as precursors of any restorational intervention. The goal, therefore, is third, to ensure material and structural authenticity, while at the same time improving structural durability. And additional principles include the idea of the relative reversibility of the interventions or a repeated possibility of restoration with the least possible sacrifice of ancient material during the internal reinforcement of the members. The intention then is to preserve the Acropolis buildings as ruin, but to restore them to a statically adequate form as permitted by their existing ancient material, thus protecting them through providing a state of preventive maintenance. On the subject of internal reinforcements of the ancient structures, the current practice of incorporating titanium reinforcement rods into the original marble material follows the previous restoration's principle of hiding reinforcements within the ancient members. The major difference, however, between Balanos's intervention and the contemporary one lies in the improved quality of modern materials and techniques. Marble from the Dionysos quarry on Mountain Pendeli, very similar to the Acropolis monument's original ancient material, has been used exclusively for any new additions. Moreover, titanium, which studies show has excellent compatibility with marble, has replaced iron for the internal reinforcements and clamps with much less sacrifice of ancient material. Now, if you are not very bored, I want to talk a little bit for a case of a contradictory intervention within the Parthenon itself, the east porch of the Parthenon's cellar. This area was the main entrance to the central chamber of the 5th century BC temple, where stood the enormous gold and ivory cast statue of the goddess Pallas Athena. The east porch consisted of 6 Doric columns with an entablature, along the top of which ran the famous Ionic frieze, generally believed to depict the Panathenaic procession. During the historical incident known in the contemporary archaeological literature as the ancient fire of AD 265, some 7 centuries after the Parthenon's construction, the columns of the pronaos lost a significant part of their surfaces that faced the temple's interior, including a major portion of their western flutes. In this altered state, the pronaos' columns, including the 2 central ones that were incorporated into the arch of the Christian church, you see it here, the back of the Christian church and the columns of the pronaos, and you can realize, you can see here the back sides of these columns that had had no flutes because of the ancient fire. The Christian church was installed there in the 6th century AD and continued to survive this porch until the end of the building in the 17th century and the final collapse of this area. In September 1687, during the Venetian besiegement of the Acropolis, as I said before, an artillery shell struck in the building and exploded, and the central area of the Parthenon was severely damaged, including the northern and southern middle sections of the exterior colonnade, the cella long walls, and the roof. In addition, 5 of the 6 columns of this east porch collapsed. And due to their previous cracking in the ancient fire, they now disintegrated into dozens of loose fragments. This destruction of the east porch was initially addressed through a partial reconstruction by Balanos in 1931. The most recent intervention, though, was again a partial restoration in 1998-2004 by ISMA, the Service for the Acropolis Restoration Monuments in the Greek Ministry of Culture, following a 1983 proposal by architect Manolis Kores. This project placed many recently identified fragments back in their positions and gave a distinctly new, aesthetically different form to the eastern area of the Parthenon. The work on the east porch was not intended to be a rescue operation, as in other operations on the Acropolis, but instead aimed to reset many of the Pronos' scattered fragments to improve the comprehensibility of the part of the monument and to preserve the ancient material by returning it to proper use. However, a variety of objections arose with regard to making such a drastic change to the long familiar form of the monument, even if the restoration were to be meticulously documented. At an international conference held in Athens in April 1989, the opinion of the international academic community was solicited concerning the extent of the Pronos intervention. A questionnaire was circulated and most responses favored the choice of a more extensive intervention. You see the choice is the 4th option with full reconstruction of the east porch and putting also copies of the frieze on the top. The questionnaire was, I said that. At the end, though, the choice of the public was not followed by the committees and the Ministry of Culture. The main concerns of the Pronos intervention were the questions of total versus partial restoration and how much new marble for infills would be acceptable. The greatest issue, however, seemed to be the unresolved matter of what the final form of the completed columns would be. That is, should the restored columns as new additions be fluted or unfluted? This disagreement regarding the final form of the columns' surfaces led to a postponement of the final decision on the intervention until 1994. When a further study was carried out by the late Professor Charalambos Bouras. The 1994 study suggested avoiding the decorative carving of the new infills, with the result that the drums would appear as smooth, simple cylinders without any fluting. The present for this option was a similar decision by architect Anastasios Orlandos, made during the reconstruction of the east porch columns of the Hephaestion in the Athenian Agora in the 1930s. One key advantage of Bouras's 1994 proposal was its allowance for the possibility of fluting the columns in the future. In other words, after restoration works on the pronaos were completed, it would be possible to reconsider the matter of the reconstructed columns' surfaces and to decide whether or not to proceed with fluting. Although this 1994 solution was for the pronaos was endorsed at the time as being fully reversible, it simply postponed the problem of choosing the final surface treatment for the columns for another decade. The practical result, you can see it at the back of the columns of this implementation, was that it's created discontinuity in the forms of the columns and an unclear aesthetic result that was incomprehensible for the visitors. Yes. The case of the Parthenon's pronaos illuminates a more general problem in restorational practices. The need to harmonize the different theoretical and philosophical, specifically what should be the final appearance of the inner western sides of the porch of the columns. I'm sorry, I lost one page here. So the different theoretical and philosophical views on the various specialists involved in a project, particularly on the overall scope and the essential goal of an intervention. In this instance, such different specialist perspectives led to unresolved contradictions that made finding a compatible solution for the monument impossible for many years. The pronaos case also highlights another central question: which phase or moment in time in the long history of an ancient monument should be preserved, restored, and presented? The modern approach to restoration, as set out by international agreements, is to accept the importance of all historical phases of a building. In the pronaos of the Parthenon, the question of which historical phase to restore was viewed differently and ultimately led to the new marble additions in the porches, columns remaining unfluted. The original sides of the columns facing the interior of the classical temple had retained their fluting for only 8 centuries, until the ancient fire, after which the pronaos columns without their inner facing flutes survived for another 14 centuries until their final collapse in 1687. So here arose the dilemma. Should the shorter classical phase of the columns with their original flutes be restored, or the columns' historically longer phase without their inner facing flutes, that is the late Roman through late 17th century phase? Should the intervention of the pronaos be guided by aesthetic or historical priorities? Then reconstructing, should we present the original architecture of the building, or should we give material expression of its historical experience? If indeed an historically longer phase is designated the most important to preserve and restore, then the main question remains: how will this preferred phase be implemented in practice? In the pronaos specifically, what should be the final appearance of the inner western sides of the porches columns? As this issue was debated, various ideas were advanced and several experiments conducted in an attempt to discover how best to reproduce the appearance of the columns' fire-damaged flutes. These forays into what was essentially experimental archaeology involved artificially destroying the surfaces of new marble samples to make them appear as if they had suffered a hot fire and severe thermal fracture. However, if the results of these experiments had been accepted and the effects of the ancient fire artificially reproduced on the columns as new in fillings, the pronaos restorers would merely have produced an artificially contrived imitation of an historical event, a theatrical stage setting, which would most certainly have contravened modern restorational principles concerning authenticity and honesty of appearance. As the Venice Charter and other international agreements governing restoration make clear, such scenographical approaches are discouraged, since newly added artificially aged or cracked material leads to a misleading representation of form and creates a chronological confusion that ultimately promotes historical forgery. Today's restorations are in no way meant to imitate the results of natural or human processes through time on the members of an historic structure, nor to artificially reproduce the accidental history of a building. Instead, an intervention should maintain and support an honesty of methods and forms and reconstruct a building as an architectural work, following and respecting its original design. No other form is therefore acceptable except for the original, as long as restorers can faithfully recreate that original form. Of course, this principle leads to the harmonious integration of new material into an ancient structure with the aim of improving the comprehensibility of its architecture. So in the pronos, the eventual 1994 solution echoed a basic theoretical principle characteristic of the 19th century restorational ideas, in which simplified subtractive reproduction of decoration was recommended for new additions. In the Parthenon, however, the simplified form of the pronos columns as new additions caused an aesthetic and historical inconsistency. In observing the incongruous final result, one might guess that an early initial phase of the temple's original construction process had been reproduced after the columns of the east porch had been installed, but just prior to the stonemason's final step of carving out their flutes. This restorational result was agreed on despite the restorer's certain knowledge that the columns had indeed been completed with flutes in the 5th century BC during the building's original construction. Many visitors to the Parthenon could be left wondering why some sections of the now restored pronos appeared unfinished, as they had been for a short time, at most 3 or 4 years, back in the 430s BC, before the Great Temple was completed. Fortunately, as soon as the pronos intervention was completed in 2004, the obvious aesthetic asymmetry of the restored columns' inner faces once again came up for consideration. A new proposal developed in 2004 renewed the call for fluting the columns as new additions, as flutes represent an important element in the morphology of the Doric columns. They are an integral part of the basic character of the classical Doric order and can hardly be regarded as a simple decorative feature. Carving the flutes in the new marble additions would remove an historical inconsistency and allow for a more accurate, pleasing appearance. At last, in a great step forward, Greece's Central Archaeological Council granted final approval in July 2009, 4 years later, for the complete fluting of the new marble additions in the pronos columns. The carving began in 2010 and is done by hand on site without any disassembly. The proposed duration of the project was originally 3 to 5 years, but still now 3 columns are completed and the other 2 are going to be completed in the next 3 years. We are a little bit late on that because other projects came over, you know, and anyway, we are going to the right direction, I think, in any case. So the Athenians in the 4th century BC, who supported the belief that the wooden ship they saw displayed in Athens was actually that of Theseus, their beloved hero from the Mycenaean and Minoan past, were attempting to ensure their cultural survival through a tangible, albeit controversial, historical artifact. That survival was deemed more important than the material authenticity of the object itself. Today, we are far more concerned with authenticity and other important principles that govern preservation and restoration. Contemporary restoration practices are the product of a rich history of changing values. On the Acropolis, the authentic relic that we call the Parthenon continues and will continue to suffer from the ravages of time and from the differing approaches or priorities of specialists tasked with ensuring its lasting welfare. As a beloved symbol of our own historical past and cultural heritage, the Parthenon has become the focus of decades of modern interventions, a seemingly endless process of restoration, but one in which thoughtful, caring, principled preservation of the temple remains the supreme value. Thank you very much for your attention.